This will be the last class on creation, and I'm going to finish up with the flood today. Next week, if you have a bulletin, and we can barely see this today because the bulb blew out. So there's a little bit less of a bulb in there right now, but I think it'll work all right for what I'm doing anyway. But next week, Carl Kirby will be here. He will actually be here on Friday night, and he will be here Saturday afternoon giving a presentation, as well as one on, I believe it's Saturday night, and then for the services on Sunday. So take a look at that. Take a look at your bulletin so you can be in on that particular schedule of his presentations. I will also give a short presentation there, as well as Dave Murray will give one too. So, the Creation Conference. So all of this was leading up to that, and then after we're done with that, then this class is going to be taken over by someone else for a while, and I'll be back probably in the middle of the winter. So today we're going to talk about the flood. We started this last time. The flood, of course, was a judgment of God because of man's continual sin. And God, as I said last time, uses his miraculous power to judge this earth and to judge man with a worldwide flood of water. And as I said, God negates natural law when he does this, and this might be a little hard to see, but it says, "For yet 7 days, and I will cause," this is God now, "I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made will I destroy." He's going to destroy everything from off the face of the earth. There's two supernatural acts in his initial judgment. Both of them are in Genesis 7, verse 11. "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were," and as you can see, number 1, "all the fountains of the great deep were broken up," and number 2, the second supernatural act is the windows of heaven were opened. So in one day, God begins two supernatural acts and we talked about this last time, I'm just reviewing a little bit, but all the fountains of the deep were broken up. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in a second. And the windows of heaven were opened. Of course, that causes it to rain. So you get waters from below pushing out onto the earth, and waters from above as rain. A lot of people, when they think of the flood, only think of, the rain that comes down for 40 days and 40 nights. But remember, the water from below really contributed probably more water, much more water, and it contributed for 5 months. So the breaking up, I had this slide in here last time, and because it's so dark you can't see it, but you can see these fault lines. This is the mid-Atlantic fault line coming down through here. Here's the United States over here, and here's the Pacific plate here. But when God judges the earth and breaks up the fountains of the deep, he's really fracturing the earth's crust, and he, of course, does this supernaturally. It divides the earth's crust into these huge tectonic plates that still exist today, and of course, as these push against each other, you get uplifting of mountains, and you get earthquakes now because earthquakes occur along these fault lines. And this all occurs for the first time now. And water that's under pressure, the fountains of the deep, which are under pressure, and as God judges this crust of the earth, these things start to collapse, and when they collapse, of course, under pressure, forces the water up onto the surface, and actually probably shoots water into the air. Along with that, you get volcanic eruptions. This is the crust of the earth. As it breaks, there's magma, which is molten rock that comes to the surface and, of course, comes through what we would identify as volcanoes. So with that, volcanic eruptions. You get this ash clouds which occur. This is an ash cloud from an erupting volcano, which push high. These things go high into the atmosphere, which is going to cause disturbance and turbulence within the atmosphere. Remember, there's a canopy at this time, or at least I believe that. That causes problems with that. And then the second phrase that states, and you can't see this at all, but it says, the second phrase is the windows of heaven were opened, and that means that there's just a torrential downpour of rain everywhere on earth, and great quantities of water come down as rain. In 7:17, it says, "And the flood," notice the words used here, "and the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark. It was lifted above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly." How many times how many different ways does he say it here, that there's a tremendous amount of water that comes onto this surface of the earth, both from above and from below. It says, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Everything is covered, in other words. And it says here, all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Everything is covered, in other words. And because of that covering, as a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 9, there are 30 references in just those chapters to the fact that this flood was universal worldwide. Now in Genesis 7th chapter, 21st verse, and this shows again how everything died, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils were the breath of life. All that was in the dry land died, and every living thing was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing, the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And then, so he says 4 times here in 3 verses that everything either it died, it was destroyed. And then he says the opposite thing here in the last part of this, verse 23. What's left alive? Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. In other words, everything dies here. Everything that has the breath of life, and that means breathing through nostrils, everything in the breath of life is dead, and if you were not on the ark, you're destroyed. And only those things left alive were in the ark. So it's put down here in so many different ways, and he enumerates the various different animals twice in these verses. So there's no doubt everything is dead. The waters, as I said, prevailed for five months before they started abating, as it says here in 24, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days, which is essentially 5 months. And so, as I said, not only rain contributed to the flood, but the waters contributed from the fountains of the deep for 5 months, 4 times longer than they came down as the windows of heaven were opened. Now, one question and one thing that I've been asked many times is there enough water to cover all the mountains on the earth? Because after all, if you look at our topography now, you see that Mount Everest here, 29,029 feet. So that's 5 miles up in the air. And then you have the Mariana Trench, which is in the western part of the Pacific. Here's Asia over here, and this Mariana Trench is 7 miles deep. It's 36,000 feet deep. So if you take the difference in the highest to the difference of the lowest part of the earth now, it's 12.3 miles. Well, how in the world can you get enough water? So where did all the water Where'd all the water go? Well, it's been calculated how much water there is on the earth. There's 325 million cubic miles of water on the earth. That's amazing. 325 million cubic miles of water. There's a tremendous amount of water on this earth. If you've ever flown over the Pacific, you know that. I mean, it goes on forever. And the Earth's topography now was not the same as it was in Noah's day. Because if you look at for instance, the Mariana Trench where there's these cracks, well, I just said that the cracks causing these deep ocean trenches were the fault, that is in a fault line of when the Earth crust was broken apart. When did that happen? Well, it happened at the time of the judgment. So it didn't exist in Noah's day. It only existed at the time of the judgment, which we just talked about. So these faults just didn't exist prior to the flood. And the forces that caused the mountains to lift up to the point of a Mount Everest, for instance, though that uplifting of the Earth's crust is also because of the movement of these tectonic plates and the forces that force those mountain ranges up. That didn't exist prior to the flood either. So if you eliminate all that and you bring the mountains down and you bring and you eliminate all these deep trenches and everything else that's in the ocean, you all of a sudden can have the earth covered with water. And one of the keys here is if the earth was flat, let's say it was just flat, how much water would there be? 1.7 miles. The ocean would be 9,000 feet deep everywhere if the earth was flat. So you can see that if you just bring the continent up, and you also take and move a lot of the water down underneath the crust in the fountains of the deep, you can cover the entire earth with water. These mountain ranges and everything else push up after the time of the flood, not prior to it. So, whoops, I think I missed a slide. Well, the earth, the bottom line here is that the earth is still, it's present here, and I'm not getting this to move. I think can you move to the next slide? Next slide. There. Here's the water from the flood is still here, in other words. It's still on the surface. This is a picture of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it's unbelievable. You look off the coast of San Diego. Actually, they say in San Diego that if you look out into the Pacific Ocean, that's the furthest point of water that there is on the earth. It actually misses. Actually, you go from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, supposedly, without hitting Australia. And you go to the coast of Africa if you went a straight line off there. This is what I've been told anyway, which is, I think it's like more than halfway around the world. But it's interesting. San Diego claims it. That's one of their claims to fame anyway. There, I got it to work. But in other words, the Pacific Ocean is huge. It covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface, just the Pacific Ocean. It is 14,000. Its average is 14,000 feet. That's 3 miles deep. There's a tremendous amount of water on this earth, and that water really serves as a reminder to us all of God's judgment of man's sin. When you go to the ocean and look out there, that's why all that water is there, because of man's sin. Now, the 8th chapter of Genesis, the first 2 verses there, it says, "And God remembered Noah." Of course, Noah's he's in the middle of this now. He's in the ark. "And God remembered Noah." Remembered is not that God forgot about him. It's that, remember, God gives them protection through this whole thing. Remember, he loads the animals, he sealed the ark. And another word for remembered is that he was mindful of them. And he begins to act on their behalf now, and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God did three things. He made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. That's first thing. The second thing, the fountains of the deep, and three, the windows of heaven, both were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So he does three things there to end this judgment. He causes a wind to pass over the earth, stops the fountains of the deep, and he stops the windows of heaven. And he does this again. He does this with his power supernaturally. So you don't have to come up with some naturalistic explanation of what's going on here. It doesn't fit. Again, you can't explain how God works in a supernatural manner with natural law. Now, so these acts begin restructuring and remodeling the earth. And the earth's crust, keep in mind, it's very unstable at this particular time. It's because the caverns which contain the fountains of the deep and the water reservoirs are all collapsing at this particular time. These tectonic plates are moving on the surface of molten rock. We've got volcanoes erupting. There's the crust of the earth is broken up beneath a tremendous volume of water. So as that crust shifts, the water seeks its own level, so it moves on the surface. The winds would occur without any land, so you have a shoreless ocean, and hurricanes. What slows down a hurricane? Land. If you're out in the water, a hurricane is just going to get more powerful. So you can get an idea. The winds and the storms are tremendous at this time. There's tremendous differences in the temperatures, which didn't exist prior to this. The atmospheric pressures are changing. So there is a tremendous amount of water turbulence, huge waves. The crust of the earth starts to shift under a constant volume of water, and this is restructuring essentially the entire earth. And you get rapid runoff, as it says in the Bible. Genesis 8:3 says, "And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days of the waters were abated." So they returned from off. Waters return from off the earth continually. In other words, there's rapid runoff of water. The water's shifting on top of the crust of the earth. So it also says in Psalms, it gives some words in Psalms on the same thing here. In Psalms 104, "Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains." Obviously, this is a reference to the time of Noah's flood. "At thy rebuke they fled." That's the waters. "At the voice of thy thunder they hastened away." You can see there's rapid runoff. The water's moving all over here. "They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, and that they turn not again to cover the earth." So what's happening here is you're really getting the 7 continents being pushed up now as the water collects in places like the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. As this occurs, there's buckling and folding of the land, and you can see that here's the crust of the earth, and it buckles as there's pressure from the tectonic plate that's out here. This is the Grand Teton Mountain Range, by the way, and this is the explanation, by the way. This is not a creationist explanation. This is the explanation from geologists of how this happened. Of course, what's the difference? They say this took millions of years. Well, the forces that did this were actually just after the time of the flood. And because of the weight of the water in the Pacific pushing against these tectonic plates causes buckling and a break and a fault to occur. And you end up with the eastern face of these mountains. And of course, if you've seen the Grand Tetons, this is looking towards the west in the Grand Tetons, and you can see that this is totally granite. This is bedrock that is pushed up here, and it's flat on this side, and there's sedimentary rock on this side. So it's the forces that cause all this are really no different. They're exactly the same as what the evolutionary geologists will say. The only difference is the time. They say it took millions of years for it to occur, and creationists would say, no, this occurred in the years after the time of the flood, as the earth was remodeled because of the forces that occurred on tectonic plates due to the weight of the water. And really, that explanation is the same. It's just the times are different. Another example is the Colorado River. Colorado River is coming through here, goes through Glen Canyon here. This is northern Arizona here. And, of course, it hits the Grand Canyon here and it ends up here and finally drains into... There's not much draining now, probably, after Las Vegas and Los Angeles and everybody else takes their water out of it. But it actually drains down here. But you see, this is the watershed of the Colorado River, and this is Denver right about here. I can't read this, but this is Denver right about in this location. But you can see as these mountains all uplifted, and if you've been to Denver, it's flat in Denver. It's flat. From Denver this way, it's all Kansas and eastern Colorado. It's flat, and a huge amount of sedimentary rock there. But all of these mountains, as they lift up, you can see that the water just rushes off of this and then goes through these valleys and cuts these huge canyons, and that's how it happened. Again, the explanations are no different. And here's the Grand Canyon on this side, Grand Canyon. Here you can see the river down here and this huge canyon. But again, the canyons are cut in newly sedimented in the sediment layers on the surface. And again, the explanations are really the same. And here you can see a better picture of the river coming through here. And this whole thing, in other words, was filled with water. That's what cut the canyon. When those mountains were pushed up because of the forces, it forced the water back out. And this whole thing is pretty much filled with water, and it just rushes through here. You can imagine the volume of water is tremendous. And when you get that much water running at that speed, you get huge forces that cut this canyon out in essentially no time. So the difference again, evolutionists would say, well, this river down here cut this canyon in millions of years. No, it didn't. It was cut just prior after the time of the flood, as the various continents drained the water from their surfaces, and those rivers and valleys still exist today. It's interesting that Henry Morris stated, and remember, Henry Morris is a hydrology physics professor. He said, when you get sharp demarcations, look at how sharp these demarcations are between the sediments. He said, when that occurs, you know that sediment was laid down rapidly, not slowly. It wasn't millions of years, in other words. To get a sediment that's that sharply demarcated, as opposed to this one, and as opposed to this one, you can see there's sharp demarcations. That means that you can only do that with rapid sedimentation. You can't do that with millions and millions of years. So it's interesting, and he was, I'm not a physicist, he was a physicist and studied this. So the sediment deposition occurred after the time of the flood. There's a tremendous turbulence within the water, and that, of course, has made turbulence within from the crust of the earth. So there's a tremendous amount of sediment in the water itself. The average thickness of sedimentary rock on the earth today is 1 mile. There's actually 5,900 feet of sedimentary rock averages on this earth today. It's unbelievable. And it varies tremendously, though, depending on where you are in the country. The rate of deposition in a flood, the rate of deposition of the sediment, is you get about 1 inch of sediment every 5 minutes. If you calculate that out to average of 1 mile of sediment, it takes 220 days. If it was all at the same time, which we say it was based on the flood, that it takes 220 days for the entire geological column to be laid down. 220 days. Of course, evolutionists say I'm a fool. I'm crazy. It couldn't have happened in less than a year. It was millions and millions of years. What they would say. But it's interesting. What evidence is there that this was laid down rapidly? Well, this slide is a little bit dark, but I think you still can see it here. Here's a person standing right here. But you can see that these sediments are bent, and they're bent at angles which would be impossible if those were millions of years old and were dried out. They would fracture. They wouldn't bend like that. You couldn't get a S-shaped bend in sediments. Look at all these sediments are bent. So there's supposed to be millions and millions of years between these layers. Well, they can't bend like that. There's no way. They'd fracture. Now, do the evolutionists have an explanation? Yeah, they do. They say, well, these were laid down and they're kind of like plastic, so they can bend rather than these are solid rock. What are they talking about? Plastic. I don't know. I didn't read the actual full explanation of it, but it's hard for me to believe. I think it makes a lot more sense that these were bent when they were soft at the time of all the forces that occurred just after the time of the flood. Another thing that is difficult for the evolutionists to explain, they do have an explanation for this, and I'll tell you what it is in a second here, but these are polystrate fossils. They go through various layers, and here's one that goes up. This is a famous one because the base of this, these are tree trunks. And you can see this is starting the root system of the tree here. And actually this is coal down here. Black coal. And then it cuts up through various layers of strata that were supposedly laid down millions of years after this coal was formed. Well, how in the world could that happen? Because this tree obviously would be long gone if it took millions of years for that to be covered. So what's their explanation? Well, the explanation of creation is easy. The whole thing was laid down at the same time, and you get this tree buried, and this forms coal because trees are organic matter, and that's how you get coal. But and then they just are buried all within the days after the time of the flood. Well, the evolutionists do have an explanation for this. Their explanation is that this tree didn't decompose, but what it did instead was it became petrified, and the petrification caused the tree not to decompose, and then it was just buried over a period of millions of years. I don't know of any trees sticking out of the ground now that are petrified and are being buried now, though. So that is a little bit difficult to explain, but that's their explanation. I think it makes a lot more sense that they were all buried at the same time. How about the billions and billions of fossils that are trapped within these sedimentary rocks? Keep in mind, we've only scratched the surface of looking for fossils. If there's an average depth of a mile for sedimentary rock, you know we're just scratching the surface here. We're not even close to looking at what the sediment contains a mile down. Fossils, everyone agrees that fossils are formed by sudden catastrophic conditions. It requires rapid burial. If you drive by a deer that's on the side of the road, you all have all seen them. They're dead deer, Minnesota all over the place. They're hit by cars and trucks. And if there's a deer on the side, or a squirrel in the city here, if that deer is not going to become a fossil. I mean, it's going to decompose on the surface. If it's a squirrel, the animals will come down, the vultures will come down and tear it apart, and the parts that are remaining will just decompose and dry up and blow away. So that you need to get a fossil, you need to get rapid burial. Things have to be buried immediately after death. These are quotations, and this is by a guy named Dunbar here. He's an evolutionist, by the way. These aren't quotations from creationists. Practically all fossils must have been formed by floods, volcanic eruptions, or other catastrophes. And that is true. Everybody agrees with that. Burial soon after death is the most important condition favoring preservation. And another quotation, the cause of these mass extinctions is still very much in doubt and constitutes a major problem of evolutionary history. It does create a major problem. It doesn't create a major problem if you read and understand the Bible. What is their evidence for rapid burial here during the time of the flood, right while the flood is going on and the sediments are coming down? This fish here is 14 feet long. It's a fossil. In that, you can see another fish within that fish. In other words, this fish ate that fish and then was immediately buried during the time of the flood. So this shows that this occurred very, very rapidly. In other words, as it says down here, digestion is rapid, but this fossilization had to be so fast that this interior fish here in the fish's stomach didn't have enough time to digest. Most fossils, by the way, are marine animals. Fish are buried. Fish or marine life is buried within the fossil record all over the place. There's many more marine animals than any other type of animal. Now, if marine animals die, if a fish dies, is it buried at the bottom? No, it isn't. It bloats up and it floats to the top and it's eaten by scavengers. That's what happens now. There aren't fossils. It'd be very unusual for fossils to be formed now, in other words. Another thing to remember is here you've got dinosaur bones. And this is a vertebrate column of a dinosaur here. But these are found all over the world. It takes a massive amount of sediment to bury a dinosaur. I mean, a sauropod dinosaur I'm talking about. I mean, these things could look in the window up here. They were standing on the ground, they can look in the window. I mean, some of their heads go 50 feet into the air. They're huge animals. Some of them are 80 to 100 feet long. These animals are huge. And they're in the fossil record. Well, how do you bury an animal even close to that size? Well, they're buried in the fossil record. So you can see that this, it had to take, in other words, a tremendous amount of sediment to bury these animals. So you might ask yourself, was there an age of dinosaurs? Well, yes, there was, because this mild temperatures existed prior to the time of the flood. So what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, I've talked a little bit about some of this already, but they were placed on the ark. But remember, young animals, they hatch from eggs. The largest dinosaur egg's about the size of a football. So when they hatch out, they're small. Those are the ones that are directed by God to save that particular species. Those are the ones that migrate to the ark. But when they come off the ark, after the flood, the weather is much more extreme. Genesis 8:22 says, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat." By the way, this is Genesis chapter 8, the first time cold is used in the Bible. Cold and heat, and summer and winter. It's the first time winter is used in the Bible. And day and night shall not cease. So now all of a sudden things are different. It's much colder than it was. The climate is much harsher. There's a lack of vegetation present on the earth right after the time of the flood. A dinosaur will need a lot of vegetation to keep itself alive. So the plant eaters died out. The plant eaters died out. The meat eaters died out. They all died out. And so they died, they became extinct sometime after the time of the flood. This is the same exact explanation that evolutionists give. They also they wouldn't, of course, point to the catastrophe being a flood. They'd point to an asteroid hitting the earth and causing tremendous amount of dust in the air, which causes poor crops, the vegetation disappears and the animals starve. That's their explanation. Our explanation is pretty close to the same, only the catastrophe is different. They say it's an asteroid, we say it's a worldwide universal flood. One of the interesting things is, did some dinosaurs survive into the post-flood era? Well, there is a dinosaur described in Job chapter 40, and it's a description of an animal anyway, behemoth. This is the description, "Behold now behemoth," notice here, "which I made with thee." He's talking to Job here. And in other words, this animal was made at the same time man was made, the sixth day. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the muscles of his belly. This is a huge animal, very, very powerful. The key to this, and understanding that it's a dinosaur and not some other kind of animal, he moveth his tail like a cedar. A lot of people say this is my Bible, for instance, says it's a hippopotamus. Some of yours will probably say elephant. It isn't an elephant. It isn't a. Have you ever seen the tail of a hippopotamus or an elephant? It doesn't look like a cedar. A dinosaur's tail does look like a cedar, though. A sauropod. He moved, and then the sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like strong pieces of brass. His bones are like the bars of iron. He is the chief. He is the chief of the ways of God. If he's the chief, that means that this is like his largest Well, what is the largest animal that lived on this earth? Sauropod dinosaurs. Those are the ones. So, even though they don't exist now, of course, they are described in the Bible. And if he's talking to Job about it, that means some of these animals survived the flood, because Job was definitely written after the time of the flood. If you look at these are the sauropod dinosaurs. They're huge. Here's man down here. That gives you an idea how large these things are. And this is a African elephant, which is the largest mammal we have right now. These are, of course, reptiles. So, could they have possibly existed at the same time man did? For any of the kids out there, if you get this on a test question, for sure don't say they do, or you get it wrong. Because part of taking a test is knowing what the answer the professor wants, not necessarily the right answer. And in this case, if you're taking a course on evolution, you're going to have to remember a lot of wrong information. But on the other hand, you know why it's wrong. But it's interesting that if you look at, this is a 5,000-year-old pottery from China. This is a Triceratops. It's got the three horns in the front. It's got the big plate around its neck. This animal is a Triceratops. There's no doubt about it. Here's being ridden by a man. But anyway, that's carved in it. Well, how would they know that? Fossils hadn't been dug up at that particular time. So how would they know to draw this thing out the way that it is there? They must have known something about a Triceratops. Maybe they were still alive at that time. Soft tissue from a Tyrannosaurus. This is so dark that you can't see, but this is actually red. This was Tyrannosaurus. This is recent stuff here. A Tyrannosaurus was found in the western part of the United States. It was dug up. The bones were looked at, and actually one of the people that was there opened up the bone. They cut the bone and found bone marrow in the interior of the bone, and it had not completely fossilized. This is hard to explain when it's supposed to be 65 million years old. So they took this soft tissue and they did microscopic sections of it, and lo and behold, they found vessels within the bone marrow. But the interesting thing is they found some cells within those vessels that are oval, and you can't see it very well on this slide at all, but they are nucleated, oval, red cells. A reptile, and I've looked at many reptile slides over the years, has an oval red blood cell that's nucleated. Looks just like this. And, the birds have them, amphibians, reptiles, fish, they all have nucleated red blood cells. Only mammals don't have nucleated red blood cells. And but they look exactly like this. I mean, any veterinarian you'd bring this to and you put it in front of them, they'd say, what is this? They'd say a nucleated red blood cell from a bird or from a reptile or from an amphibian or a fish. They all would. And that's exactly what they found in this Tyrannosaurus. Well, how does that work? How could that possibly be 65 million years old? It can't be. It can't be 65 million years old. They're having a very difficult time explaining this, I'll tell you. But they are not backing off that it's 65 million years old, because they can't back off it. Because if they back off it, they're into this book real quick. Whoops, I must have gone the wrong way here. What about the Ice Age? Did an Ice Age occur? Well, yes, it did. And you can see state of Minnesota right here, and the ice covering down as far as Rochester. In this area, anyway, is where the ice was. And it, of course, went from this southern border all the way to the pole at that particular time. When did this occur? Right at the time of the flood. Canopy protection is immediately lost. What happens at the poles? The temperature drops immediately. It drops to the temperatures it is right now. The average, I wonder if anybody here knows the average temperature of the South Pole. The average temperature at the South Pole is 56 degrees below zero. The highest temperature that it's ever reached at the South Pole is 9 degrees. That's the highest. It never gets to freezing. It never even gets close to freezing at the South Pole. So a lot A lot of people don't understand just how cold it is at the poles. So you get this ice pack, which occurs immediately. This is the reason why I'd say that the flood occurred during our winter time or close to our winter time, because all of this ice occurred at this particular time. The temperatures were, of course, cold all the way down, included North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, where we have pretty severe winters. So it occurs immediately after the flood. As I said, the canopy's lost, everything gets cold. The permafrost occurs in those areas. Canada, there's 2,000 feet of permafrost up towards the northern border of Canada. In Siberia, there's 5,000 feet of permafrost. That means that the ground is frozen 1 mile down in Siberia. The southern edge, of course, the ice age dissipated rapidly with the change in seasons over the years. The Minnesota and Mississippi River valleys are huge. This is one of the reasons they're huge. They drained off. The Minnesota River is the one that drains off a lot of the glacial ice from the ice age. And that's why the valley is so huge. When you're driving to Minneapolis, notice how huge that valley is next time. That Minnesota River didn't cut that. There was huge volumes of water coming through there, not only because the continent was drained off through the Mississippi, but also because of the ice age that followed it. If you go to northern Minnesota, essentially there's no sedimentary rock in northern Minnesota. This is up towards the boundary. This is in the boundary waters, by the way. I think I've been at this rock face, as a matter of fact. But this is solid granite. This is not sedimentary rock. This is solid bedrock. And that's what you find in northern Minnesota. Well, why isn't there any sedimentary rock? Because the sediments couldn't invade into the ice as the ice froze, and then it melted off. And you get huge boulders up there, but you don't have much sedimentary rock, as you can see from these trees that are struggling to grow between the cracks. And you do see trees up there, of course, but if you ever try to put a tent in up there, try to put a tent stake in someplace. You can't do it. It's solid rock. But the interesting thing is if you go down to Texas and Louisiana, where there's a lot of sedimentary rock, the sedimentary rock there in South Texas and Louisiana is 12 miles deep. 12 miles. That's why there's oil down there, because of the vegetation that's buried. You're not going to look for oil in northern Minnesota or in Canada, in the eastern part of Canada where there's just bedrock. There's nothing buried there. But you go to where it's buried, that's why the Gulf of Mexico's got oil, because there's miles and miles of sedimentary rock that, of course, form the oil. Now, I'll probably end with this. We're getting a little over time, but mammoths and mastodons, and this is a mammoth here. This is a famous mammoth over in Russia. They are encased in ice in the northern, up towards the northern part of Siberia and Canada. These animals are encased in ice. There are hundreds of thousands of them there. Hundreds of thousands of them encased in ice. Some of these animals, their soft tissues are totally intact. You can see the skin of this animal, and this thing is supposedly thousands of years old, 35,000 years old, I think it's supposed to be. It was buried at the time of the flood. And the reason it was encased and trapped in ice was because the temperatures at those poles, they dropped immediately, and that water coming down turns to ice immediately and encases them in ice. Some of these animals have been found with food in their mouth. In other words, they're eating at the time, and food in their stomach, having just swallowed and eaten, and they're encased in ice all of a sudden. Well, how does that happen? How does that happen on an explanation on an evolutionary standpoint? Very difficult to explain. Easy to explain, though, when you understand how the flood occurred. So hundreds of thousands of these animals are up there, frozen with food in their mouth. It means an extremely rapid death. The there's some frozen mussel that's been found to be in excellent condition, and meat scientists looked at it and said to get it, there had to be a drop of 100 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 1 minute to freeze mussel that well, and then preserve it. So meat science has even looked at this. Well, I think I'll skip oil, cave deposits, all these things, and I'll go to the last slide. It's close to it anyway. But here, Genesis 8:16 says, and the bow shall be in the cloud. This, of course, is the rainbow. And I will look upon it, and I will remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all the flesh that is upon the earth. And, of course, the everlasting covenant is that God is not going to judge the earth again by water. He is going to judge the earth again, but the next time will be by fire. And I would say that the rainbow didn't occur until the time of the flood, and that was God's covenant between man. As it says there, it's an everlasting covenant.